that started to hear about this kind of increase in policing within the school gates, and young people started to talk about these experiences, and we started to realise that this was happening a lot more than we had understood. And going forward, we kind of did different community events, and we put in a freedom of information request to Greater Manchester Police, and found that they had an intention to put in 20 more schools-based police officers into schools in this coming academic year. Now, we have lots of our concerns about that. Obviously, kind of discriminant and racist policing was our kind of key concern, and how it would impact particularly Black communities and working class communities. But a real concern was that actually no one had really been consulted. So that's kind of where the report came from. So over the last month, we surveyed 554 people from across Greater Manchester who gave their input on how they felt about, if they had experiences of a regular police presence in schools, how they felt about that, but also how they felt about the prospect of more police in schools. And that was getting insights from young people, teachers, parents, guardians, community members, youth workers. And we knew that there would be pushback for lots of the reasons that we understood. But overwhelmingly, people came out to say that it was something they felt really negatively about. So 9 out of 10 people who responded said that they would felt negatively about that. So there are lots of reasons. So much came out in the report about our concerns, particularly in schools where regular police presence already exists. So criminalising young people for non-criminal behaviours, stigmatising young people, setting a real low culture of expectations, because, you know, these officers are being put in areas where there is a higher proportion of ethnic minority people and working class areas, and they're not being put in grammar schools, private schools. So it's setting an expectation of those young people in particular. But some really concerning accounts came out from young people, particularly who are in schools already with a policing presence. So there's so much in the report, could probably talk about it for hours.
You think about, again, when you're talking about those communities, you do think about the relationship and the history that a lot of those communities do have with the police, and why they would be suspicious about why they would want to be putting the police in their schools when they're not even willing to go into those communities and build proper relationships with the communities. Who is pushing, or who has pushed for this to happen? Because I have read that Andy Burnham has made comments on this and has said that he believes that the police in schools would prevent youth violence. Yeah, I don't know if he went into more detail around why he believes that. Did he, as far as you're aware?
So I did my master's research a couple of years ago on this topic as well, on police schools in Manchester. And at that time, I interviewed Andy Burnham. And initially then, yeah, it was clear that he was kind of behind these implementations and that he was pushing it forward because actually he'd had head teachers who had said that this was something that they wanted, and that he supported that because they had said that. And I think that's kind of quite a small group of head teachers. And yeah, what he kind of often pushes back as a key argument for them is to tackle youth violence. But actually, we know from what we see in America, where this is already happening, that actually policing isn't the solution to those issues. That's not the solution to root causes of youth violence. But he doesn't really go into explaining exactly why that's going to help prevent or challenge those issues. And it's always been quite kind of unclear in the answers, I think. And now, yes, it kind of, when I initially started exploring this topic, it did seem to be coming from Andy Burnham and these head teachers, but it's kind of slowly been passed over to Greater Manchester Police now in terms of who's dealing with the communications on this issue, and particularly since the report came out, it's them who've now started kind of steering the answers back to us.
What are these? What is he saying that the head teachers are saying to him?
That it would help them regain a bit of control in schools. But I think the issues there are that schools are really under-resourced, and that resource needs to come back into teachers, into counsellors, into pastoral support. And he's saying that actually what he said to me was they could be a real pastoral support, which, you know, for me, and I think you can see through the report, that actually that's not going to be the case, particularly for Black young people who have these experiences in the community of over-policing and really kind of violent and often discriminatory policing. It's not going to make them feel better in school. It's going to make them feel significantly worse. It's going to make them feel anxious. So many of the young people who contributed said that, you know, the thought of having a police officer in school, or the reality of having one, you know, it affects their well-being. So that's not going to help improve relationships.
No, not at all. But where would the funding for these police, or where in the schools that they are already stationed, how is their presence? If there's not enough money to bring in the counsellors or other pastoral workers or youth workers, where's the money coming from for the police to be there?
Yeah. So this is one of the real issues, and also one of the things that keeps it continues to be communicated really unclearly by those who are implementing it. So when I first started interviewing for my master's research, what Andy Burnham had said at that point was that if schools were willing to pay, whether that was fully or whether that was part-time, then they would get a police officer. And there is a school in Manchester that pays themselves out of their own budget for their school-based police officer. But since then, and as things have developed, it seems that actually Greater Manchester Police and Greater Manchester Combined Authority are putting a part of a budget, or have come into some money to put towards those schools-based police officers. So at this point, I'm not sure whether actually they're going to be part funded by schools, in some cases fully funded by schools, in some cases funded by Greater Manchester Police. It seems really cloudy, but there is a school in Manchester that currently pays for it out of their own budget, which is really, you know, it's not my ambitions for education. I hope that it's not the community's ambitions for education, that actually that money is going into policing instead of educational resource. So yeah, it's been a confusing communication line that has seemingly changed over the last couple of years.
With the school, like you mentioning, that when they've already got a police officer in the school, have the parents of children who go to that school been following your guidelines? Are they getting a response from the school in regards to taking a police officer out?
Yeah, so so what's firstly difficult, and we've seen this in the first week back in school, is that actually parents don't know before they send their kids there that there are police in schools. So a parent I spoke to at the start of the week who's had some issues with the school, I let her know that a schools-based police officer actually worked at the school, and she didn't know. And even when she was on the phone to me, she went up to her son and said, "Is there a police officer at your school?" And he was like, "Yeah." So that's an issue in the first place, and that actually parents are going in and putting kids into schools where they weren't aware this was happening. So we really need to get the message out, but it's difficult because we don't know exactly where all the officers will be going. But in terms of what parents can do, they can continue to press their governance boards, their parents kind of associations. They can keep us in the loop of any experiences of negative or discriminatory policing. But I think where the real weight comes in, and where we see the kind of most power, is teachers and school staff working with their unions. So we've been backed in this campaign by the National Education Union's Black Members Organising Forum, and they've pulled together some great kind of resources for teachers to put motions through at their school to kind of challenge their head teachers to try and either remove or challenge the implementation of police officers. And I think the real strength is going to come locally from school to school, because this isn't a massive policy issue across the country. This is really kind of flexible and kind of locally inputted. But I think the real weight's with teachers, but parents should certainly try and challenge through the kind of senior leadership and through the governing board, and say that they don't want this, and point to the report and say this is why and these are my concerns. But in the report there's lots of kind of suggestions of what you can do, and speaking to MPs and local councillors, again raising the concerns. You know, there's some MPs who've said, okay, well, when you have evidence of why this might be wrong, please come back to us.
Evidence of when if it might be wrong.
Yeah. And, you know, it's frustrating because, you know, so for example, Lucy Powell, I mean, she's been great on lots of issues in the community in terms of over-policing. You know, she does loads of work on joint enterprise. But, you know, she said, well, I've just heard that this is what people want. So if you have any evidence otherwise, then please come back to us, which was kind of a big leader in why we thought we need to put this report together, because we know this isn't necessarily what people want. But also, you know, our report is important, but there already is evidence. There's all of the evidence from decades.
I don't know if this has been put to. They must see that a police is just going to be seen as an enforcer, and are they in the schools in uniform? Yeah. So the officers that I know of, they're there in uniform. I think there's some occasions where I think someone in the report reported back that theirs wasn't in uniform and they play quite a low-key role in and, you know, kind of stay behind closed doors. But again, this is the issue with it. It's the inconsistency. And it's not that I'm calling for consistency in what they're doing, because I don't want them there at all. But there really is a inconsistency in how they're going to be in those spaces. But of the officers we know, whether they're kind of dipping in and out in more of a neighbourhood officer way, or whether they have a full-time job in a school, they've been in uniform. And yeah, they are seen as the enforcer. That's exactly how they're seen. And I still think that this idea that relationships can be improved it's continually held on to, but schools shouldn't, and our children in our community shouldn't be used as the testing ground to see whether relationships can be renewed for discriminatory policing that continues to happen week after week. You know, you can put a police officer in school being nice to kids, but on the outside, you know, we still have Black people being tasered by Greater Manchester Police, and everyday interactions of stop and search. That's still ongoing. You know, there's a whole institution to tackle, and you don't fix that by just saying, oh, maybe they'll have some nice relationships and everything will be better. And they haven't, when you look at the report, they haven't really done a wide consultation. I mean, they haven't gone into schools and said, let me do an assembly, you know, with children and ask them, you know, how they feel and get their views, nothing like that.
So what they point to, what the Greater Manchester Combined Authority point to, is a report on that looked into youth violence across Greater Manchester. Now, this was a report, I think it spoke to about 300 people, but it was on a much broader topic. So it was on the topic of youth violence, which obviously is huge. And they pointed to a section on schools-based police. And honestly, it was about a page of a 70-page report that had mainly young people who said they didn't want it, but then a couple of paragraphs saying that it might help bridge some gaps. But it really wasn't the kind of in-depth consultation that we've done, not specifically on the topic of schools-based police and with, you know, 554 people. So no, there really has been limited consultation. And in our report, 95% of people who replied said that they hadn't been consulted. And those that did say they had been consulted have been consulted by our community projects.
Wow. The other issue for me, I did a show a few months ago with Charles Critchlow, and he talks about the qualification of police officers, and he made the point that many don't really have a qualification. You go to police college or whatever, you know, you don't have a degree. And I think that they are now looking at that type of level of upskilling and educating. So therefore, when they're talking about putting officers in schools, what is the skills of the ones that they're looking at? Are they PCSOs that are in the community anyway? Are they I don't know, special weapons and police that they're going to have in there? Are they intelligence officers who are there to get information and, you know, put that elsewhere? Did that come up at all?
Yeah, so what I'd say is they don't know what they're looking for. That's, you know, there isn't a specific rollout line. It's not necessarily as if they are recruiting a whole new bunch of people. Some of them have kind of, yeah, I think are likely to currently be police officers, and maybe now they're being placed into schools, but that's quite unclear. But what you say about kind of the qualification or the ability to be working in a school, I think what came up in the report is that, yeah, they're not trained to be in that space, and they're taking on roles of educators quite often. So we saw quite a concerning section. You know, we had a theme in the report about inappropriate conduct, and there were quite a lot of accounts of people adults seeing police officers in schools almost acting as educators, but giving the entirely wrong information. So the wrong information about sex and sexual health, or the sharing of child imagery, and just giving information to young people that was legally and factually wrong, because they haven't been trained, and they don't necessarily know the different educational spaces that they're now being put into, and they're now being expected to take a role in, and that was really concerning. But I think if you're asking what they're looking for in that role, I think they're going in under the guise of improving relationships and supporting the school staff. But you said intelligence there, and I think that's a really key part of the real reasons why they're there, is that they will be intelligence gathering, they will be contributing to gangs databases, which we know discriminate against Black communities and are made up of Black young men in particular. We know schools-based police officers have contributed to Excalibur's information, and that is often off the back of policing young Black people's cultures, interests and networks, not crime. So I think, you know, if we're going to explore actually what are the real reasons behind why they're there, I think they come back to that kind of surveillance, intelligence gathering, over policing of Black communities.
Yeah, well, just a couple of the things that I'm hearing already in regards to the negative impact of them being in the school. Was it yourself, Roxy, you posted about the police threatening to go to the housing with one of the parents? If you want to touch on that.
Yeah. So we've already had this year a community members say that they had the schools-based police officer threatened to get the housing in, and I think, you know, what you see there is this real overreach of power, and this real.
Why would somebody do that? Why would somebody threaten to get housing involved in school?
So it came up when I interviewed as well for my master's. One of the police officers I interviewed spoke about that same kind of thing. Like, these young people know now that you know, if they're going to misbehave, we can get the housing in, and it's an entirely unreasonable response to behaviours. But the problem is now that the schools-based police are working in such multi-agency settings, and while that sounds like a good thing, and often there is, you know, a lot of good that comes to multi-agency working and people being in communication more, actually what you see with policing is that they're now in rooms with the head, the housing, social work, etc. And it's almost as if a lawyer described it to me actually, like recently, that they're kind of the puppet masters of all those different agencies. And they know that they have power over young people's lives and families' lives in all of those different ways, where actually, yeah, a police officer can say, I'll get the housing in, because they can make a call and say, we might know about this in this young person's home, or we're concerned about this risk. But we know that ideas of risk are often discriminatory and constructed around certain young people from certain backgrounds. But it's just a complete overreach of power. And it's, you know, even if they don't get the housing in, I think what they're doing and what they'll continue to do is use things like that as a threat. And you know,
that's disgusting.
Yeah, it is. But that kind of use and abuse of threats like that, you know, one respondent to the survey, a young person, said that they police brought the dogs in to an assembly in school, and the dogs sniffed around the assembly to see if people had drugs. Now, that in itself is disgusting and quite scary, well, extremely scary for lots of young people, and it's, you know, treating a whole school of young people like suspects. But then what happened after that is that they were continually threatened with that might happen again. You know, this has happened once, don't let us bring the dogs in again. So it's this kind of using this to uphold this kind of climate of hostility for young people in schools.
Some people might think that they'd actually be an excellent addition to a school, and they might believe that they can actually transcend their uniform and their police links. What's your views on that?
Yeah, I guess what I'd say in that context is that the issue of racist and discriminatory policing is not, we're looking at institutional issues here, not necessarily looking at individuals. Now, I've no doubt that, you know, a school could get a schools-based police officer who could be really lovely to children, right? I'm not going to say that's a complete write-off, but that's in the same way that there could be a police officer in the community tomorrow who is nice to someone. Okay, those things happen, but actually what we're dealing with here is years of a police force that continue to arrest Black people more, taser Black people more, disproportionately kill people of colour, over police their areas, stop and search more. You know, it's an institutional issue that unfortunately it really can't be undone by people who may have the best of intentions. And I actually think what you then find, and then when you enter the institution, is that actually you either have to go with it or you're going to be persecuted for challenging it, especially if you're a person of colour trying to enter the police force. I think you either have to go with it or you're going to face challenges. And I think challenging from the inside, I don't think always goes well for people. And yeah, it's beyond individuals. You know, of course, I'm not saying that every single person is going to be horrendous, but what we have here is a force that continues to over-police the lives of particularly Black communities and continues to do them harm. And the police force were created to cause harm against working class communities. I think that's the key thing that we have to remember here, is that they weren't set up with good intentions, and we need to start thinking about how we undo that setup and start thinking about positive solutions that are beyond, you know, good individual officers.
Just talking on that history and trying to, you know, maybe get some understanding on that side of things as to why people may be skeptical when you look at the history, but also the reports, the several reports that have consistently been written about the relationships with the police in Black communities or disadvantaged communities. The most famously, obviously, is the Stephen Lawrence Macpherson report, but there have been reports before that and reports after that. And I remember there was one report that actually described GMP, the state of GMP, in the sense of looking at issues of racism, as needing the equivalent of a heart and lung transplant.
Yeah. I mean, the history of policing is largely and mostly a negative one. You know, the police in this country were set up to protect propertied middle class people from working class people. That was the intention. And if you look at the kind of history of policing in America, you know, they were kind of the replacement for slave patrols. So, you know, the reason they were set up was not to do the thing that we kind of have the narrative around them now, which is they protect and serve the community. We've kind of reshaped this idea about them. And the more recent history is, like you said, we've got, you know, although it's important that we did this report, we shouldn't have had to, because we had report after report after report of racist policing. We have the Macpherson report, like you said, we had the Lamy review in 2017, that of course that was about the whole criminal justice system, that you can see the impact of policing as the entry to that criminal justice system. There are so many reports. A recent report that was written by a group called Resistance Lab that Anjali and I are a part of, that shows taser is a growing threat to life in terms of its use by Greater Manchester Police, especially against Black people. So, you know, there's so much evidence to show in reports, but also just evidence in the community as well. I mean, that can't be ignored. We get video after video and story after story, and everyone knows it, what's happening. Evidence is equally valid, you know, regardless of whether it's documented in a 70-page report or not, that the police are institutionally racist and continue to be. So our report, you know, it needed to be done because people want to point to reports, but we have enough evidence to show that this shouldn't be happening and that this isn't a solution.
Okay, how much? Because I know in the report, the Decriminalise the Classroom, you do make reference to America and schools and what has happened over there. What for you and what you put in the report does stand out as a pertinent example that schools, the mayors, parents should be taking on?
Yeah, so I mean, firstly, the input from American and Canadian activists that we kind of gathered for the report is really important as evidence. You know, I think lots of people try to say like our police aren't like US police, but actually, you know, they are the same. They just don't have the same set of tools. But we're following America's school to prison pipeline step by step in terms of implementing that and solidifying that. And over there, you can see that schools' resource officers exacerbate violence, don't reduce it, that they kind of accelerate a young person's journey from school to prison. And we're going to completely copy that. So we do have lessons that we can learn from America and this kind of start of removing them from school, from schools. But I think in the report, but there's so much anecdotal evidence that this shouldn't be happening, particularly that from young people. But, you know, there's the example I gave about the dogs, but there's also lots of accounts, I think that was quite concerning and maybe less expected, accounts particularly affecting young women of kind of victim blaming by police officers or sexualization of young people by police officers in a school space that was really concerning. And I'd really point to that because I think while often when we talk about policing, we do focus a lot on the experiences of men in the community, I do think that the school will become a space in which young women become over-policed for who they are.
Why do you say that?
So you had scenarios where young people talked about they had to roll their skirts down, otherwise they'd be blamed if male teachers started to be attracted to them. That was the kind of anecdote that a police officer put forward, or a police officer keeping lists of young people who were having sex under the age of 16. And this very odd and inappropriate conduct that started to emerge that was kind of voiced by young women and has been voiced outside of the report by young women as well. So I am concerned about how that encroaches on their lives. So you have that, but you also have, incidences of over-policing non-criminal scenarios. You know, a young person outside of the report spoke to me about kind of walking down the hall and dropping a Vaseline, and instantly the schools-based police officer comes out the office and says, "What is that? Show me," because the officer believed that this girl had drugs on her. And then when they realised it wasn't drugs, there was no apology. They just went back to their office. There's lots of these kind of threatening accounts. One young person shared that in a pupil referral unit they were in, that actually young people would often be searched in a glass box inappropriately for everyone to be able to see. Another young person asked what gang they belonged to when there'd been no issue to do with gangs, but it was this assumption that this young person must be a gang member. And while these aren't, you know, the kind of images of that young girl that we've seen in America be pulled out of her chair and thrown across the classroom, that isn't beyond what is going to happen here. That will start to happen here. That violence and harassment will certainly start to happen, and there are anecdotes of that in the report. But it's this complete encroaching of policing into every area of young people's lives that is really concerning who they are as people, their housing circumstances, as we mentioned. Yeah, it's really worrying.
What can people do if people are hearing this, or people have read the report? I don't know, I haven't got right to the end of it in the report whether it said, look, if you're unhappy about this, or you need more info about this, or you want to get to the right person, what can people do? What can young people do as well?
Yeah, so people generally can write to their MPs, write to their councillors to say that they oppose this, because our political figures need to know that there is opposition. You can, as I said, as teachers, work with your unions to try and challenge this and pass motions to get police out of your schools. You can continue as parents to lobby your Parents Association and Governor's Board. Young people can continue to keep us informed of their experiences of policing in schools, because we need to continually collect anecdotal evidence of how young people are being treated. But young people and members of the public, adults as well, can join the campaign, so we can continue to build together in campaign meetings with new ideas about how to challenge this. But it's really pushing that report out there as well to other community members, because like I said, lots of people are unaware. But you can always reach out to the projects as well. And we'll be pulling together a petition as well soon for people to sign. So there is something that people can get involved in beyond just Greater Manchester as well, because whilst we're lobbying and trying to campaign here in Greater Manchester, this is a national issue, and you know, police are really already embedded in schools in London on a much larger scale, whereas we're at a real kind of pivotal point here in Manchester where we have the chance to try and overturn this before we get to the point where we are a reflection of London. Head teacher I interviewed as part of my master's, I won't name the school because they were kind of anonymous in that piece of work, but he was very much, you know, he's in an area where the demographics are the same in terms of the young people who be going to that school in comparison to those where they're going to schools with schools-based police officers. So again, a working class area with a high proportion of Black and brown people in the community. And he said, absolutely not. You know, this is not happening in my school. You know, they've got there's tensions in the community with the police, but also we don't need it. We don't need it if we are putting the right kind of behavioural support in place, if we're putting the youth work in place, if we've got the right strategies to supporting young people's well-being. And if we're going to put, you know, he said within the research, if we're going to spend money on something, then I'd rather spend it on a full-time counsellor. And there is no way that a police officer is coming into this school. And you really do get that impression from that school that they are completely committed to maintaining that, upholding that, and looking at actually what the young people within their care need and want, as opposed to what can really play a part in like enforcing punitive discipline. And yeah, you know, within the NEU, within the National Education Union as well, as I said, we've been supported by the Black Members Organising Forum, and lots of teachers from across the UK have picked up this report and said they agree with it. You know, the idea that teachers are behind this, which I think is really what's being over pushed from Greater Manchester Police and the GMCA. I don't think it's entirely correct. We've got lots of teachers on the ground, including in senior leadership, who don't want this to happen, and they'd rather have more.
But in the sense of bringing people and people coming to the table, how difficult do you think that is, or going forward with the report? Is that something that is a tool to get people to talk about this more?
Yeah, so I mean, in October, we're going to be looking to put on an event around the report that invites the community to have us explore and explain it a bit more, especially if people haven't, I mean, it's a big report, so especially if people haven't had the chance to go through it. You know, we want to bring the issues to the forefront and discuss it with people and discuss what solutions can be, and also what alternatives can be as well, because we don't want to just say no police and not you know, push forward alternatives. So I think there's a chance for people to come around the table in terms of the community and people who are, you know, really care about young people and invested in their lives, youth workers, community groups, etc. I don't think that political power will come to the table on this. And I think that's because, one, they've ignored us on this issue continually. You know, we've pressed them on it and they continue to kind of really not engage in it, but also because policing is a political winner. And it has been. Law and order continues to be politically a really good vote winner, because people, the majority, feel protected by the police, despite the fact that they've never probably engaged with the police. They've been unharmed by the police. They're the people who really want the police, which is, you know, it's bizarre. So I think whilst policing is something, you know, that the country wants and the country wants more of, I don't think political power will come to the table on this, but community power will. And that's where, you know, my hopes are and where I think the strength is as well.
Brilliant.